beautiful Santa Barbara, California. Does it have a darker side? What's cracking, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. New video. This video today was requested this morning, right, by somebody from my city. From his comment I get, he's a lot younger than me probably. And I don't know that this video is going to be interesting to a lot of people, to a wider audience. However, I have been asked to do this video more often than I would have thought. And so today we're going to go ahead and knock it out. Santa Barbara is one of the most beautiful cities in California, probably in the world, right? We have everything here. We have the beaches, we have mountains, we have lakes, we have a forest, gorgeous women, beautiful city, beautiful architecture. It's a very, very gorgeous place, and it is known as a tourist town. Always has been. The majority of the money that they make is from tourism, okay? And it surprises a lot of people that there have been barrios here going back decades. So my dad is 74 years old, and my dad is from a gang. He's from the east side. I'm from the west side. Historically, the east side and west side are worst enemies. And I was asked to give a history of the gangs of Santa Barbara. Now, I can give some history that I know, especially in my neighborhood. I can't give the history of other cliques or barrios in Santa Barbara. I would just be making stuff up, and I'm not going to be doing that. I will say that from talking to my dad, back in the days, Santa Barbara, again, has always been a tourist town. And so while my dad didn't like the west side, it's funny, he told me that back in his days, back in his teenage years, Santa Barbara was all one, but you had different hangouts. So you had different hangouts on the east side, you had different hangouts on the west side. You didn't necessarily have what later wound up happening, right? From what my dad told me, it was this: the beefs that Santa Barbara dudes had back in his days was mainly with out-of-towners. Chiques, the different barrios from Chiques, Ventura. He said even Fresno, dudes from Fresno would come all the way. And what did they come for? The women of Santa Barbara, because Santa Barbara is known to have beautiful women. And so he said back then, we would get into stuff with other cities, other places, because they would come into SB and they would try to be with our ladies, our primas, our sisters, whatever, and it would start beef. And that was what they were doing back then, okay? It wasn't until the 1970s when Santa Barbara basically exploded. A lot of different barrios were formed in the 70s from the hangouts that had existed prior, right? Some of the more well-known ones, you would have the Westside Locotes, which is the oldest clique on the west side. You had the Westside Locos, you had the Eastside Locos, you had Calle Milpas Locos, you had the Hoods, you had Ortega Parque, you had the Eastside Winos, you had the Projects, and I'm sure I'm missing a few other ones, but those are like the more well-known, more established from back in the 70s. Now, I can't give the history of all those because the majority of those were on the east side and they were a generation ahead of me, right? But I do know some of the history and what wound up happening. So in the 70s, there was this thing called the OTG, the original, or the Oldtown Gangsters. I think it was the Oldtown Gangsters. And the Oldtown Gangsters was made up of dudes from all over Santa Barbara, right? And then around 1977, the OTGs broke up. And out of the OTGs came Ortega Parque, SB Locos, and a few other things. 1979 is when the Monteria Village was built and opened for business. The Monteria Village is the Westside Projects. Prior to that, you had the Laderas and different apartment complexes on the west side that had been turned into projects. They were originally owned by private owners. The county stepped in, Section 8 the whole complexes and made them projects. But the Monteria Village in 1978 was the Westside Projects. And what happened was a lot of these dudes came from the OTG and they moved in. Several families moved into the projects. Initially, they didn't even have a name yet. There's a family that is given credit for creating the projects. And it's a very well-known family in Santa Barbara, and especially in my neighborhood in the west side of Santa Barbara, and that is the Beltran family, the Beltrans, right? And I'm going to let you know the truth, the reality of that right there. The Beltran family have always been acknowledged as like the family of the Westside Projects, and they were. But I have to be honest, from what I was told, because I've always wanted to know the history of my neighborhood, right? And I was cellies with one of the original dudes from the projects, and he told me, he goes, you want to know something else? He goes, we were running around, we didn't have a name yet. We were just running around in the projects, doing our thing, and we were just starting, 1978. And he said, it was the Beltran sister. Yes, she had just paroled. She came into the projects and saw everybody hanging out, and they didn't have a name yet. And so one night they were partying, and she goes, hey, come on, let's take some pictures. And you guys all remember the old Teen Angel pictures, in the 70s, they would pull out the cameras. And she goes, let's take some pictures. And she said, I got a sweater made up too. And they held up the sweater, and it was the Beltran sister who made a sweater, and it said Westside Projects or something along those lines. And that's where the name came from. However, something to point out, for those of you from SB, from the surrounding areas, you may have never noticed this. All the cliques on the west side is all one. Different cliques, but they're all one barrio. And sometimes they bump heads. But everything on the west side starts with a VWS. And then, so you would have, I'm from the Tiny Locos. So you would have, I would have spray painted as a kid, or I would have said, or I would have wrote VWS TLS, Barrio Westside Tiny Locos. The homies from the Loquitos would have wrote VWS LKTS, Barrio Westside Loquitos. Vatos from the Locos would have put VWS LS. Vatos from the Tiny Tools, etc., etc. The vatos from the projects have never wrote VWSP. They write Barrio, they write VPR, Westside VPR. Westside Barrio Projects Rifa. A lot of youngsters don't know that the projects were kind of their own barrio. The only ones on the west side that were their own, that considered themselves their own barrio, but ran with the west side. It changed later, but in the 70s and 80s, you had some dudes from the projects, especially in the 80s, you had some that used to say, and I'm not from the same barrio as you guys. They used to tell us from the tiny locals. They say, we're from the projects, homes. We represent the West Side. We'll back you guys up because we're all West Siders, but we're from barrio projects. So the barrio projects, the West Side projects started in 1978. The Westside Locotes started before them. I want to say in the late 60s. I know it was in the 60s, at least from what I was told. That's the oldest barrio, the oldest clique. I can't say barrio. The Westside is the barrio. The oldest clique on the Westside that's still in existence is the barrio Westside Locotes. Then came the projects. Now, keeping it 100% real, the projects were bullies. Most of the big dudes in stature, physical dudes, were from the projects. The projects were big in numbers and in size, right? And then, they call themselves the Lower West Side Gang. Anything south of Carrillo Street, on the west side in Santa Barbara is considered Lower West Side, and all that territory is considered the projects territory. The Upper West Side is where my clique formed, and I formed the Tiny Locos, also known as AKA the West Side Tinies. I formed them with a handful of dudes because of the bullying tactics of the projects. That's the reason why the TLS was formed on the West Side. You see, you had dudes that claimed projects that actually lived on the Upper West Side. And they would try to tell people what streets they could walk down. Like, hey, Holmes, you can't walk down this street. You got to go, a block over, or you got to go 3 blocks over. Charlie. And so myself and a handful of dudes got together, and we formed the Westside Tiny Locos. Now, I'm going to go ahead and get in depth. Most people from the Tiny Locos right now don't know the history. And the first name of the Tiny Locos is going to blow a lot of people's minds. The original name of the Barrio Westside Tiny Locos was Westside 14. Yeah, Westside 14. It had nothing to do with jail, had nothing to do with North and South. It had to do with the original dudes that came together to form the clique. So it was Westside 14, and we started spray painting it in the neighborhood. We started hitting it up on the bus. We get on the bus, whatever. That didn't go over well with the older homies that were pintos, that were getting out of the joint. They were like, what the fuck is this 14 being written everywhere? Right? And so, of course, we had to change it. We had the older homies from the locals and the projects like, what the fuck is this? Right? And it became Barrio Westside 13 Locos, VWS TLS. And it was that name. The 14, Barrio Westside 14 was brief, right? Very brief. But it was the original name. And then it became Barrio Westside 13 Locos, VWS TLS. And I believe we were TLS, we were the 13 Locos for about maybe a year. And then it was a problem. It was a problem because nobody can own that number. That belongs to someone else, right? And you had homies that were claiming Westside but didn't want to be from the projects and didn't want to be from the TLS because there was going to be conflict there, right? And so they just were claiming Westside 13 is what they would say. And you had homies that were from the TLS that were like, hey, Holmes, hey, you hear so-and-so saying they're from the TLS. They weren't saying they were from the TLS. They were saying Westside 13. Basically, they were a Westside resident, but they were going to bang the Westside and handle whoever didn't like it. And so next thing you know, dudes from the TLS were wanting to jump dudes, and were jumping dudes that were saying they were from Westside 13 but hadn't been jumped in. So that's when I said, hold up, Holmes. We can't just fucking be smashing on homies that we're growing up with because they don't want to pick a clique. And I had told the homies, look, the initials are not going to change again. VWS TLS is going to be the initials. And long story short, the 13 turned into Tiny. And that's how the Water Westside Tiny Locals got their name. The reason why we're established, as I said, was because of the bullying tactics of the Westside Projects. And that was how now you see where the projects and the Tiny Locals came from. Not to toot my own horn, because there's nothing to toot about when you think about, we're talking about gangs and how they formed. But in my opinion, my personal opinion, the most influential clique ever on the West Side was the Tiny Locals. So after the TLS formed, there were other homies that wanted to get into the Tiny Locals. The Tiny Locals were known, the homies from the projects weren't jumping anybody in. They had stopped doing that like in 1988. All you had to do was hang out with them and be accepted by them, and you could say you were from the projects. You could tattoo it on you. And those of us from the Tiny Locals, from the Tinies, no disrespect to the homies, but we felt that was soft. And the Tinies were known, when we jumped dudes in, there was a lot of times where we sent the homies to the hospital. And our whole idea was, we're going to treat you like an enemy to make sure you're not going to run. Your instinct is not going to be to run. And so we would hurt dudes. So we had other homies that were even younger than us that wanted to get into the Tinies. And we knew the way we were hurting our own homies to get into the Tinies, there's no way we could do that to these vatos, because, you know, we're 14, 15. They're 10 and 11 years old. 12 years old, and we were like, these guys are too little, right? So what we did is I told them, listen, homes, you vatos are too little. Why don't you vatos start your own thing? And we will back you up, because the projects are going to come and they're not going to like another clique forming, because they want people to help their growth still, right? And so, long story short, I'm not going to get into the whole thing. The Westside Locotes now they call themselves, formed because of the Tinies. They originally wanted to be Tiny Locals. The Westside Destroyers, same thing. The family that started them, the Lopez family, wanted to be from the Tiny Locals. But they wanted to bring all the dudes. There was a lot of them. And they wanted them all to be from the Tinies. By that time, I was in the California Youth Authority, and the homies were writing me, hey, this is what these vatos want to do. And I told them, hey, homies, I'm doing time. You vatos figure out what you're going to do. I know who my homeboys are. And so my homeboys told them, look, homies, that's cool. There's a lot of you vatos, but we don't know you all. We know the Lopez family. There was like 12 of them that they knew, and they were like, you 12, we can jump in. And the rest, you vatos got to earn your way. You know what I mean? Like, we don't know who you are. And the Lopez family are like, hey, but these are our homeboys. So the homie said, okay, same thing they did with the Loquitos. You guys form your own thing, homes. We'll back you up if the projects don't like it. And that formed. You know, there was somebody from the east side in my comments that when I mentioned certain cliques, he was like, I never heard of them. And I'm like, yeah, well, you're younger. Because on the west side, we also had the West Side Trouble Street. That didn't last long because they tried to form south of Carrillo Street in the project's territory. The West Side Trouble Street lasted probably 7-8 months, and they were absorbed into the projects. We also had the West Side Little Locos. Those were the guys that were youngsters that were too young to get jumped in, And they were basically the AAA team that those dudes were gonna get into the Westside Locos. You had the Westside Tiny Toons. Again, they were too young, too little, they were gonna be farmed into the Tiny Locos when they were able to take an ass whooping by the Tiny Locos. And then you had the Westside Rascals, who were gonna be from the projects. The 80s and 90s is the era that I'm aware of, that I know. In the 90s, I was only out 5 months. And I can tell you that Santa Barbara was a completely different animal in the 80s and 90s than it is now. The East Side around 1987 was damn near extinct. They started trying to come around. The ESG was formed, I believe, in 1987 by Catfish. Shout out to Catfish. That's a really good dude right there. But 87, 88, 89, the East Side was pretty much non-existent. Maybe 30, 35 dudes from there. And it was the ESGs. And honestly, and no disrespect, we didn't know what the ESG was. On the West Side, we didn't know. During that time, I have to tip my hat to the vatos from Goleta, especially the Party Boys, the Galito Party Boys, as well as the G13, the G13. 87, 88, 89, we were bumping heads more with the vatos from the Party Boys and the G13s than the East Side. By far. The East Side, like I said, they had... So in the 80s, a lot of dudes went to the joint. And it didn't affect the West Side the way it did the East Side. It hurt the East Side. However, when I got out in 1993, the East Side was... I would say there was probably about 300 dudes from the East Side at the time. At the time, the West Side easily had 500-600 dudes, right? The Party Boys from Goleta were no longer in existence because the Party Boys from Santa Paula weren't feeling them the West Side was bullying them. Not the Santa Paula Party Boys, the Galito Party Boys. The West Side was bullying everybody. And the homies from Santa Paula Party Boys did not like hearing the same name of theirs being done the way they were being done, and they drove out to Goleta and told them, hey, either you vatos change your name or you're gonna have pedo with us. And you know, they were already catching a lot of blues, and so they changed their name. There was also another clique out there in Goleta, never a factor. N Street, I'll give it to N Street, but N Street never really we didn't really bump heads with N Street too much. It was mainly the Party Boys and the G13, the Galito Projects. The East Side did, like I said, when I got out in 93, the East Side by then now had the Crazies. Right around the time I got busted, I think the Traviesos formed around that time. You know, those of you that always ask me about Sad Boy Loco. Sad Boy Loco's from the Traviesos. They're younger than me. The Crazies and Traviesos are I don't think I ever had any. I mean, I remember having one run-in with the Crazies. And it was because they went to the Cornerstone Church on the outskirts of my neighborhood. We happened to be driving 3 carloads, actually headed to the East Side, 1993, when I was out. We were headed to the East Side. We were hunting. And we saw this crowd walking to the mobile gas station on Mission Street in my neighborhood, which is on the top of my neighborhood. And somebody in the car that we were in said, hey, Holmes, and use a derogatory term towards the East Side, and goes, that's them vatos, eh? So boom, we all pulled in, and when we pulled in, we recognized that they were all like 13, 14, 15 years old. And we weren't going to do nothing to them, right? And we're 19, 20 years old. And so we just, we got out of the car on them, surrounded them, and let them know that if they want to go to that church, they can go to that church. But if they ever came to the gas station again or went anywhere in the neighborhood, they weren't going to be able to walk around no more. And they left. And that was the only run-in I ever had with the crazies. The crazies did wind up becoming a factor for a little while in Bruta. I was gone, but I heard about them. They became a little bit of a factor. The Traviesos, I don't know anything about them. I remember in the joint seeing a homie, and he knew this dude from the east side, and the dude from the east side threw up the T, you know, the way like you see. I can't how do I get my hand in there. And I looked at my younger homeboy who's from the Tiny Locos, right? And I said, hey, Holmes, why is that vato throwing up our clica? And he looks at me and he goes, nah, he's from the Traviesos. And I remember being irritated. And I said, how in the fuck did you guys let another T form in our city, Holmes? To me, that felt like that was crazy. But anyways, I don't know the history of Carpans because I know that I have a few loyal subscribers from Carpans. I don't know the history. I know the barrio, but I don't know the history. I don't know a lot of the East Side history. I don't know, you know, and like I said, I don't expect this video to be widely viewed, but the way the question has been posed to me and in the comments, and especially today, was, can we at least get this history of our city? And I can only give the history that I know. You know, I'm not one to embellish, sugarcoat. You know, I'm not one to talk about winners and losers and who was harder and who wasn't. You know, I see in the comments there's times where, and I'll probably get some on this, you know, Vatos will tell me the East Side's running shit, this and this and that, and you know, I don't know, I'm not in the streets. I'm in the city, but I'm not in the streets, right? And I only know my experience, and my experience would be completely opposite to anybody saying that. And anybody my age or remembers my era, my generation, and if they're honest, they know the truth. But before I go, I want to say this. You know, I am the one that formed the Westside Tiny Locals. And I'm glad that my neighborhood, that when I drive through my neighborhood, I see kids playing where we used to hang out. The gentrification process that happened and is still happening and will continue to happen in Santa Barbara because of how gorgeous the city is, I think that's one good side effect of it. The fact that I see these kids having an opportunity now. You know, in my era, they used to say only two things come out of the West Side: a dope fiend or a gangbanger. That's it. I remember when homegirls used to get pregnant or homies used to get their ladies pregnant, they used to move out of the neighborhood. They would move to the East Side, or they would move to Lompoc, or they would move, eh? And they used to say, I'm not going to raise my kid here, eh? I love my neighborhood, but I'm not raising my kid here. You know, it was, you know, and there's going to be people that are like, yeah, Santa Barbara, this and that. And that's fine, Holmes. You know, you can believe what you want to. But the West Side was a very, very, very poor neighborhood, Holmes. It was the poorest part of Santa Barbara with the highest crime rate. And a lot of us were coming from broken homes, and we sought family amongst each other. And I think that's why we were the way we were when it came to beefing with other neighborhoods, eh? Because we really, really did consider ourselves family. Unfortunately, we were so hurt, so traumatized by things that happened in our home lives that we didn't understand that we did have a family. It was just dysfunctional. And that's the story for most gang members, man. They come from some trauma in their lives, eh? And that trauma forces them to build a wall around themselves, create a new character that can protect who they really are from the hurt, the pain of that trauma. And I lost myself in the process of trying to protect who I really was. The kid that was getting beat every day. The kid that was not being fed. The kid that had to fend for himself from a very young age. That's who I was. And I built up another persona to protect that kid. And I lost my way in the process. And I became the monster that I created. And the monster that I created hurt a lot of people. To this day, the projects, the tiny locos are still hurting people. And I feel like I carry some of that burden. And that's another reason why I do the videos that I do. And that's the reason why I did this one, man. Because I said, I can talk about stuff, but I got to make sure there's a meaning, there's a message to it. And that's it, man. Those of you still caught up in the criminal thinking and the gang banging and shit, I get it, man. I understand it. But there's got to be something, or you have to find that something that means more to you than you. When you find that something that's more important to you than you, then you can make that your priority. And then maybe get out of that criminal thinking. It's my video for today, man. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Everybody, please be safe. Be smart and tell the ones you love that you love them. I'm out of here.